things. And one of the questions to ask, okay, is to feed people. Everybody? Does everybody get to eat, or just some people? What about the quality of food? Does everybody get to eat good quality food, or do some people get higher quality than others? What about the cost? We pay 10% of our income, some people pay 50 or 60%. 1 billion people in the world are food insecure. 30 million people in the United States are food insecure. And that's it right there, the cost. And we know that the cheapest food is the least nutritious. And so if you're poor and you're trying to maximize your calories, you're not eating very good food. And is it safe? I'm not going to get into food safety issues today, but this large complex system, food safety problems get magnified. Make a profit. Well, who's going to, and one of the reasons farmers are leaving is they're not making a whole lot of money, but how much of a profit is reasonable, and who's making the profit? The average farmer gets 20 cents on the dollar of the food. That's the average. A lot of them make a lot less than that. So where's the other 80 cents? It's all the middlemen. That's where all the profit is in the food system. Protect the environment. I'd say we're not doing a very good job there. 60% of our food is harvested or picked or whatever by migrants. What about their pay and conditions? Does that matter? Okay. If we pay them more, that means we're going to spend more money for food. But it's one of the trade-offs. Supporting rural communities. As there's an inverse relationship between poverty and food insecurity in the rural communities and food size, or not food size, farm size. So as farms operations get bigger, poverty increases. Because the large operations tend to be corporate. They're hiring lots of migrant farm workers. It's not family run anymore, and the poverty levels go down, or the poverty levels go up, and food insecurity increases. And then ethical treatment of animals, I'm not going to get into that as well, but that becomes a trade-off as well. Certain ways you can get more meat cheaper, but then there's the issue of how the animals are raised. So if we look at it as a kind of a continuum, and I have sustainable in quotes because all these operations or all these approaches would argue they're sustainable. We could debate that. So some people like, instead of sustainable, they like alternative or regenerative. But they tend to be smaller, more local, more labor intensive. In smaller operations, you end up with less, large machinery. More management decisions are involved. More seasonal and more biodiverse. A lot more variety on the particular operation. The middle, which is the one that's being squeezed, the kind of the mid-sized operations, often family-owned, it's very difficult for them to compete. They're too big to compete with the small operations. They can't sell a lot of their stuff to CSAs and farmers markets where the profit margin is a little bit higher. And in the same way, they can't compete with the large-scale operations because they just don't have the economy or efficiency of size. And the large operations tend to be monocultures. High inputs, meaning pesticides and fertilizer. Cheaper, in quotes, cheaper at the food store. But it's more consistent, year-round. Strawberries year-round in the stores, etc. Tends to be more meat-oriented, at least in this country. And a few corporations control it. If you look at most of the food system, a handful of corporations, 4, 5, or 6, control 80% of grain, 80% of meat production, 80% of poultry. Okay, so you have a handful of corporations that are calling the shots. But one approach doesn't work in all situations. If you look in the third world, lots of labor, lots of small operations, not much infrastructure. Okay, so the solution there, in my mind, is quite different from the solution here in the United States, where we don't have many farmers, but we have a lot of infrastructure. So you can't, I don't think we can take solutions here and impose them on other countries. So I'll highlight a bunch of things here, and then some of those we'll talk about in a little bit more detail. So we have some environmental problems. Water, land pollution, loss of biodiversity, loss of topsoil. heavy use of pesticides and dependence on pesticides. Energy, food miles and meat, although that's not it by any means. Production of fertilizer takes a lot of energy. Processing food takes a lot of energy. But these are two things that people tend to think about, so we'll talk about that briefly. Farmer's income, I mentioned, only 20% of the food dollar at best goes to the farmer. Ethical treatment of animals, GMOs, genetically modified, which we're not going to talk about today. We can talk several days about that. That could go under a whole lot of them. It could go under environmental issues. It could go under economic issues because only one or two companies control GMOs. It could go under food safety issues. So it's down here just to have it on the slide, but it could be placed a lot of different places. Contamination, antibiotic resistance, you have heard a lot about that. I will talk a little bit about nutrient dilution because I think that's maybe a topic you haven't heard about before. And then food security. Who has access to food? And food security in the local sense and in the global sense. Those of you from Colorado know that in the last couple of weeks we've had several articles from the food bank about how they're just getting slammed with increased numbers of people coming to the food bank because of food insecurity. I really wanted to get a slide with two elephants because there's two elephants in the room, I think. And one is climate change. And whether you think it's man-made or not, there's certainly something going on. And that's going to have a huge impact on agriculture. The temperatures are changing, so some crops won't grow where they used to. Water or lack of water is a problem. Drought in some places, but also this rising sea levels. Most of the rice grown in Asia is in river deltas that are just a little bit above sea level. Sea levels rise, there's a very large percentage of the world's population that's going to have problems. And the other elephant is population growth. Now it's certainly slowing the rate of growth, but more people demand more food, and even more challenging, I think, is that more people demand more grain-based animal protein, which puts more stress in the environment. Now, what I want to contrast, and some of you have seen these slides before, but I still think it's useful that the industrial agricultural system has a different philosophical approach or perspective from sustainable, and so sometimes we're talking at crossroads. The problems are seen as differently, and the solutions are seen as differently. Industrial ag is rooted in reductionist scientists and experimental biology. Let's take, what do we need to fertilize? We need potassium and nitrogen and phosphorus to fertilize. So, looking at, or taking a gene from one species and putting it in another species. That's very reductivism. Sustainable ag is rooted in ecology. So looking at integrated systems. So right off the bat, the perspective is different. Whole systems versus the pieces of the system. So industrial ag tends to, we're the top dog, we're going to impose our will on nature, we maintain productivity by agricultural chemicals, the food supply is dominated by processed and nutrient-fortified foods. Sustainable tries to be in harmony with nature. The concern is with the soils. If we have healthy soils, we have healthy plants, and etc. And the idea is that less processed food and more whole foods. So in the United States, 45 million tons of fertilizer, a billion pounds of pesticides worldwide is used. And it's not just that we're using all these chemicals, but the making of fertilizer is an enormously energy-dependent process. They capture nitrogen out of the atmosphere and put it in fertilizer. So it takes a lot of energy. Pesticides are made out of oil. So the food system is really very dependent, and the cost of food is very dependent on the cost and availability of oil, which, as most of us agree, is eventually going to decrease. Almost 3/4 of the phosphate we use in fertilizer comes from Florida, mines in Florida. The supply is diminishing, so it's not just the decline in oil availability, but some of the other substances that are dependent on fertilizer, or that the food supply depends on the fertilizer. If you haven't seen Hungry